So I'm going to be doing a series this week where for the 5 working days of the week I'll have a different tip that I've used in terms of caring for my houseplants and making sure that they are doing the best that they can. So each day will be a different topic, culminating on the final day of the week, on the Friday, with possibly my weirdest plant tip, at least for most people. So stick around until then, because I promise you that one might surprise you, and it's also something that I've not necessarily shared with a lot of people, but it's worked like a charm for me. So yeah, on to the video of this day. So number 1 is going to be the water that you use to water your houseplants. So I've got the quintessential, really tacky looking plastic watering can that most people have, I think. I don't know if they still do this, from IKEA. But just to prove the point in terms of watering. So one of the things you want to do when you're looking at kind of a bit of a watering can, let's go into that first, is something with a long, narrow spout, which means you can get into the soil of some of these larger, more bushy plants that you might have in the house. You don't want something that's got a very short and stubby spout, because you'll end up like watering everything around the plant as well. The other thing to remember about houseplants generally, if you've only got a couple, then it's not too much of a problem, especially if it's plants that are not as fussy about their water, like I'm thinking the snake plant, Sansevieria, or the ZZ plant. Anything that's kind of a bit more robust, like succulents, generally won't have too much of an issue. But a lot of the other houseplants have got the thinner leaves, like your philodendrons. Maybe the philodendrons aren't quite as fussy, but definitely the calathea, the ferns, they've got very, very thin leaves. They generally don't like tap water. It doesn't matter where you are, it doesn't matter how good the quality is of your water, they might just tolerate it a bit more. It's got chlorine, it's got fluoride, if I'm not mistaken, in some of the water, possibly some bromine as well. Those are all the things that are causing a lot of your plants to get brown tips, because essentially that's where all those chemicals are going to at the very end of the leaf, and that's what's causing the crispiness of the leaves. Now, the reality there is that it won't kill your plant necessarily. It might do if you use tap water with any form of carnivorous plants. The carnivorous plants, realistically, they want either distilled water or rainwater, so something which has almost no chemicals in it and it can be as pure as possible. Same thing goes for when you water your air plants. I know people don't always talk about that, but air plants generally will do better with the same type of water that you will do for your carnivorous plants. But what I used to do, and I'll tell you what I do now, what I used to do is I used to have a Brita filter. I used to filter the water. It didn't take out all of those chemicals, but it took out a good chunk. And most of my plants, and I use the calatheas as a litmus test because they're the most sensitive and they're all the ones that will show that browning at the tips a lot faster. It still had some browning, but nowhere near as much as it would have been if I was just putting straight tap water in there as well. What I have done since then, because I am that crazy plant person, is I have bought, and it's a big investment, it's not for everybody, but if your collection is growing considerably, so over 100 plants, and you definitely want to keep them in the best condition because you might be doing plant swaps or anything like that, I have actually bought a reverse osmosis system. And they're not cheap, as I said, and it takes a bit of plumbing to get them connected onto the taps at your house. And a lot of people who've actually got aquariums might probably know about this. You can sometimes you can go to a pet store or a garden centre that might sell aquarium materials essentially, and they might be able to sell you reverse RO, reverse osmosis water for your plants. It's meant to be for aquariums, but you can buy it for your plants essentially. But if you don't want to keep doing that, I know there's people that are using bottled water to water their plants, which to me is completely wasteful and just not a good use of plastic in any way or form. Like, please do not do that to the environment. Definitely try something like a Brita filter to begin with if you're really kind of worried about it. And then if you go into crazy plant person territory like me, think about getting a reverse osmosis system. But yeah, that's a bit more about watering your plants. Number 2, And this might not come as a surprise to most people, especially because you've probably at least heard me mention this in pretty much all of my videos so far. Soil. Getting your soil mix correct. And I'll mention it again. I have done a video on my IGTV, and you can actually find that in my profile. I've also linked it at the stories right at the top, so you should be able to easily access that. But getting the right soil for your plant. Now, as I mentioned in previous videos with me, and I'll bring this up a bit closer, you can see what consists in my airy mix, or my airy aroid mix. And I'll just quickly go through it. It is cocoa coir, which is husks from coconut that are shredded. As I say in my other video, check that there's no high salt level, because a lot of times where cocoa coir is processed is near seawater, so it might actually have some salt water within it, some salts within it, because it's rinsed with the salt water. Perlite, which is expanded volcanic rock, which is kind of rocks but popcorn. It's the stuff that looks a bit like polystyrene balls. It will help with drainage. Then I'm just looking down because I'm trying to remember what else is in this, because there's quite a few things. There is also, I use orchid bark as well, that helps with that drainage. And then just other amendments. I also add worm castings, which is worm poop, which is also known as black gold. And that helps with a bit of natural fertilizer. It's almost like a bit of an organic slow release fertilizer within the soil. And then you could add micellar fungi in it as well, which essentially are a bit of a root amendment. I will let you go and have a look at my other video where I explain that a bit better. And I'm trying to think what else. Oh, and also a bit of shredded up sphagnum moss. If you've got some laying over or some leftovers from when you were doing your propagations, it will really help with certain types of plants. So, and essentially those are the ingredients that I use for everything. And then it's just the ratios of what you want to use depending on your plant. So if you've got an anthurium that likes to stay a bit wetter for longer, or an alocasia, use a bit more sphagnum moss in it. If you've got things that like to dry out a bit more, like for instance, your succulents, you just use maybe the cocoa coir and a whole bunch of perlite if you don't have any sand as well. Sand is another thing that will just help it drain really quickly. If you've got things like calatheas or even ferns, I still like it to be relatively chunky, but again, use a bit more of that sphagnum moss in there. Maybe bring in some vermiculite as well, which is similar to perlite, but it is puffed up rock, but it's a different kind of rock. I'm not entirely sure what, but that one tends to retain moisture a bit more, and that's why people use it for seed germination. So just make sure that you're putting in the right dosages. And now I know I've got a lot of followers that are in the big cities and they don't have space to have all of this stuff. You can just do this with regular potting soil, so houseplant soil and perlite, so you only have to buy 2 things, or even if you can avoid, I'd say, the houseplant soil because it's got peat moss and it's not renewable. I'd always go with cocoa coir if you can get it. You can get it in essentially dried up bricks, which don't take up a lot of space. You then put them in some water, they expand considerably, so you've got a lot more left over after that as well. And then some perlite, and essentially just mix those ratios. So if you've got most aroids and most plants that like to get some air onto their roots, do a 50-50 mix, 50% of the soil or cocoa coir and perlite. And then if you've got things that like to retain moisture a bit more, say for instance a fern, add maybe 20% perlite and the rest of it will be the soil, and kind of do it that way. For instance, if it's something like a succulent, maybe do 60 or 70% perlite and the rest of it cocoa coir. You're just going to have to play that by ear and see. You'd still need it to retain some moisture even for the succulents, but just not for very long. And that's how you would kind of utilize soil to give your plants the best chance of success. Number 3. So the thing that you also need to be taking into consideration is the pot that your plant is in. And I've given here 2 examples of what I use for my aroids, which like their roots to be a bit more airy, and you kind of want some of that moisture wicking out so it doesn't sit within the soil for too long, so that the plants don't necessarily go towards root rot. So these 2 things are terracotta because it's porous, so it will leach out some water, and you can see some of the salts here. That is from the fertilizer. It might be from any kind of minerals that might already been in the potting mix. Always, always, always remember to have a drainage hole or drainage holes, plural, at the bottom of your pot. With most terracotta, it's just the one, but with the plastic pots, you'll get several. Do not put it in a container that doesn't have a drainage hole. I don't care what plant you have. That is a sure way of killing most plants because you have no control about how, like overwatering that plant. You need that water to be able to flush out. So the other thing to kind of bear in mind with this as well is when it comes to watering with things like this is water and then let the water percolate through, especially if it's something that's dried up considerably. It might come through really quickly. Water, walk away for 2 or 3 minutes, come back and water again, just so that you can make sure that that water is going to the soil all the way through into the middle of the pot as well where there's roots. Because if it's something that's really airy like this, there is a chance that the soil might compact and it might dry out considerably and it turns into a bit of a solid brick in the middle. That's how you would kind of get around that. If that doesn't work, then sit the whole pot into a container with water and let it percolate up slowly. That could take up to half an hour. Just bear that in mind. The other thing for possibly people that are a bit more into their rarer aroids is something like a net pot, and you can find this online. If you search online, there are some really, really expensive ones, there are some really cheap places. If you want to know a place that does them quite cheaply, drop me a comment down below and I can share a couple of links. But this is the same thing as using a terracotta. It's just got even more aeration. This could potentially work quite nicely for certain orchids as well. Just be careful with the orchids because some of them have got really chunky roots and they might go through the holes, and it's going to be really difficult for you to then repot it. It might get stuck in this net pot, and that's something to bear in mind with this one. You definitely want to also bear in mind with something like a net pot that you want your soil mix to be as chunky as possible. If it's really fine, you can see as soon as you water it, it might all kind of flush out. So make sure it's nice and airy and chunky. So, and this one, if you don't like the look of it when it's out there, it's really easy to just put it in a cachepot, so a decorative pot on the outside, so you would never be any the wiser essentially. This is also something that you would use if you've got leca, so clay expanded pebbles. If you're doing that with your plants, if you're trying to move them onto semi-hydro, you would kind of put it into this, and then you'd put it into a cachepot with water actually sitting in there so it can wick up. But that's only if you're using leca. If you're using regular airy soil mix, then you can just water it as normal. The only one I don't have here, ironically enough, is possibly the most popular pot, which is the nursery pots, and that's all the plastic pots that most of these plants will come to you in, essentially. Never throw them away because a lot of the times they're not recyclable. See if you can keep them and reuse them as much as possible. And those pots, for instance, these things will work really well with things like aroids. This will also work as well with succulents because it will take away some of the water, but this is mainly for aroids or maybe even the semi-hydro, the leca. The plastic regular nursery pots, you think about things like your ferns that like to retain some of that moisture, your alocasias as well, although I do have some alocasia and terracotta as well. They generally prefer to be in plastic because it will retain some of that moisture in a bit longer. Ferns, alocasias, and obviously calatheas. Calatheas, you definitely don't want to necessarily have a calathea in anything like a terracotta pot because you will be watering it on a regular basis. It is a very thirsty plant and it likes to remain relatively moist as well. So plants like that, by all means, keep them in a plastic pot. If you don't have the time, the money, or the space to invest in pots like this, and you've only got plastic pots and that's all you want to use, that's still fine. You can still grow. Obviously, that's how a lot of the nurseries are doing it. Grow some of these aroids that are used to kind of more airy soil mixes that also have a propensity towards going towards root rot in a plastic pot. Just make sure that your soil is as airy as possible, essentially, so that there's no chance of that water stagnating and causing root rot. So yeah, that is a bit more about the pots that you're supposed to be using. Number 4. So arguably something really important that not a lot of people who are starting out will think about is fertilizer. So making sure that your plant is getting the nutrients that it needs to be its best self, essentially. So if you think about most of these plants that we've got as houseplants out in nature, they'd be on the ground or they'd be in nooks and crannies of trees, but they would be getting nutrients from leaf debris, rotting matter around them essentially, and that will generate what these plants need, which is things like phosphorus, potassium, calcium, sulfur, magnesium, nitrates as well. So definitely make sure that you invest in a decent houseplant fertilizer. You can see here I will swear blind to liquid gold leaf. If you're in the UK, you know what I'm talking about. If you're in Europe, I know they're starting to ship some larger orders potentially to Europe. America, I don't think they're shipping at the moment, but you can get together with a group of friends and do a bulk order, and I think they will ship much larger orders as well. And also you want to make sure that the delivery cost kind of makes sense, because it can be quite expensive if you're just ordering one for the States. But this stuff is awesome. It is like gold essentially, because you can use it with semi-hydro. You don't have to mess around with having all these different bottles about your micronutrients and then your blooming or your growing fertilizers for the semi-hydro. Everything is within this. It also has some of the trace minerals as well that a lot of the times other fertilizers won't have in it. And yeah, I mean, you'll see if you do a quick search on Instagram how many people are raving from this. I don't think I've ever had a bad comment about this, so this is one that I swear by. But you don't necessarily have to have this. I know if you just get a decent fertilizer, and I know people talk about it needs to have different proportions of the different chemicals depending on the plant. Like a succulent would have a much lower percentage of all the chemicals that it needs, and other plants might have a different one or a more balanced fertilizer. I started doing all that and it's a headache and a pain, and even me that I've got all these different plants. If you find one decent fertilizer for your plants, all you need to do is just add a bit less and dilute it even more if you want to have something a bit lower, like for your succulents. But yeah, remember to fertilize your houseplants, and they will thank you for it by growing strong and healthy and large. So yeah, remember to fertilize your plants. Number 5, and this is the last one in this series, and this might also come as a bit of a surprise to a lot of people. This warning for this one, I'm going to be showing some bugs. Whether or not I'm going to be able to show you in the camera really quickly, I don't know. If not, then I might be able to kind of do a shot later on. I don't know whether or not that is actually focusing. If not, I will add a little clip. Essentially, this is something that I stumbled upon, and this is actually one of my secret weapons when it comes to a lot of my aroids in terms of avoiding things like root rot getting out of control. So this is something that I used to use with, I still do with my terrariums, and it's kind of, they are known as the cleanup crew of most terrariums, and they essentially survive on decaying matter within the soil essentially. These are springtails. They're tiny little things. Some of your plants already might have them in the soil. They look a bit, they're kind of white and thin and tiny, and they will spring up. That's why they're called springtails. But what I found, accidentally may I add, but it's actually kind of done me great favours, is you can buy these in most reptile stores as well, because some of this is, they have it for kind of terrarium, for bioactive terrarium maintenance, and also some of the smaller reptiles or amphibians like dart frogs. My dart frogs, when they were really small, would eat these as well. So this is my secret weapon, because I put it in the soil mix, with plants that I'm a bit worried might have some root rot, or they might be leaning towards root rot, possibly some plants that have come in from the Far East that the roots are a bit questionable. And what I have found so far, and I can't scientifically verify this, it's just in my own experience, is those plants do exceptionally well, because these little critters will stay within that pot and they will kind of munch away at anything that might be rotting in the soil, including some root rot. So I've been able to stave off root rot and also potentially slow down root rot more so than it would have been if it didn't have this in, I think, at least in some of my plants. So it's not for everybody. Not everybody wants to necessarily be dealing with bugs, but these are out in nature. There's possibly things that they might have in their natural environment, and it's also what's helping them survive. So I swear by this. I really, really do. And if you do want to experiment a bit more with that, definitely try finding some Springtails online. You can buy large or small quantities and add a tiny bit into your plants. With these that are in here, how I feed them whilst they're not in, just make sure that obviously their soil is remaining moist. You can put a tiny bit of fish flakes in it as well that you would use for like an aquarium, or I bought some food for these when I bought them from a reptile centre, but essentially it's just a bit of yeast really. You can just get some yeast, and I know it's a bit easier to get yeast these days. You might even be able to get away with something like nutritional yeast, but yeah, they seem to be really happy, and it really helps with a lot of my plants in terms of staving off some root rot. So yeah, top tip, try using Springtails if you're a bit worried about root rot with some of your plants.